¿Qué tal? ¿Cómo estáis? Buenas tardes a todos, a todas. Muchísimas gracias por venir a Conde Duque esta tarde. Mi nombre es Juan Evaristo Valls, soy profesor de Filosofía de la Cultura en la Universidad Complutense de Madrid y hoy tengo el gusto de entrevistar, de conversar con Renata Salecl, a quien presentaré brevemente antes de empezar nuestra conversación, que, como sabéis, lleva por título La descortesía del mundo y ha sido curada con el cariño y la inteligencia que la caracteriza por Giselle Echeverry. Renata Salecl es una filósofa, socióloga y jurista eslovena, reconocida por su aguda reflexión sobre cómo la ideología, el miedo y las elecciones moldean la vida contemporánea. Profesora en la Universidad de Ljubljana y en la London School of Economics, combina el psicoanálisis lacaniano con la teoría crítica y el pensamiento social para analizar fenómenos cotidianos como la culpa, la ansiedad o la obsesión por elegir correcta y constantemente. Autora de ensayos como La tiranía de la elección, Angustia, La pasión por la ignorancia o el último de ellos, Maleducados, la mayoría publicados en ediciones Godot, Salecl examina cómo el capitalismo neoliberal convierte la libertad individual en una fuente de presión y frustración y aborda las paradojas del capitalismo afectivo para invitarnos a repensar el papel de las emociones y la ideología en nuestras decisiones. Es de todas estas cuestiones que hablaremos hoy. Y bueno, como decía ahora, me pasaré al inglés y haremos la conversación en inglés. So Renata, thank you very much for being here with us. It's such an honor and a pleasure. So in The Tyranny of Choice, you speak about how the modern abundance of options can paralyze us. Do you think this freedom of choice truly makes us freer or more vulnerable to anxiety and constant regret?
Yeah, thank you. And when I looked at choice, my first question was, what is really this ideology behind, which kind of pictures everything in our life as a matter of choice? So, I'm not against choices. We can make rational choices, but when you look at the issue of choice, you see that many times our choices are linked to what society perceives as valuable choice. And many times, there are unconscious mechanisms at work when we choose something that might be quite damaging for us, So first, choices are not linked to maximizing our well-being. Sometimes yes, but many times they might be self-defeating. And, second, the ideology of neoliberal capitalism actually created an impression that everything in our lives is a matter of choice, which is then linked to the feeling of guilt. When something goes wrong in our life, we feel guilty that we made wrong choices. We also are under anxiety, to make kind of the right choice meaning that it will bring us happiness, success, advance, our well-being in society. These are all the ideas. So at the end, my conclusion was that the ideology of choice actually is a perfect mechanism to pacify people, that they are critiquing constantly themselves. They are not thinking about social choices, but they are obsessing about which individual choice they should make. And for example, when we fall ill, now the idea is almost like you have to choose to get well. You have to choose also, in the domain of love. The idea is that love is also a choice. How your children turn out appears to be a matter of choice, which is all creating, this feeling that we are never good enough. And also, in some way, the anxiety that, that we did not think hard enough when we were making the choices.
Yeah. Actually, one of the dominant ideas of like capitalism, which you deal with in your book, presents the individual as a sort of an absolute creator of their own life. And life is conceived as a sort of blank canvas at their disposal, right? This sort of ideology of creation, choose yourself, create yourself, etc. Yet this ideology, I think, of self-choice ignores the material conditions in which life unfolds and creates individual responsibilities where there are actually structural failures, right? How does this forgetting of the collective operate? To what extent has the culture of performance and self-demand turned freedom into a burden rather than opportunity?
Yeah, and that is the biggest trick of this ideology, that even poor people, you know, who did not have the possibilities actually to make choices because of economic constraints, might easily perceive, you know, that they didn't make the right choices. That's why they continue to be poor. I remember when I visited Santiago in Chile, a friend of mine, a professor of political science, told me when we were walking on the street and there were many street sellers, you know, and he said, you know, you won't believe that many of these poor people who are selling here on the street here actually think that they should make better choices to make advancement in society, and that it is sort of up to them, you know, how the next step in their life will go, while they actually are very constrained, you know, they can't easily get good education at that point. Their children might not get good education. And in some way, this ideology of neoliberalism also, you know, kind of makes us, you know, afraid that we will lose that little what we have. You know, that's kind of another anxiety which kind of pacifies us. And also, you know, that we are envisioning that maybe our children will make it, you know, so that idea that we will make it somehow in the future, you know, we will suddenly become successful is, for example, very much guiding the, you know, kind of the new ideology of manosphere, you know, kind of, you know, or the kind of the new populism of the extreme right and so on. That's sort of like the idea also, you know, that people just need to be more smart to kind of find, you know, a kind of a tricky way to enrich themselves and, you know, maybe find, you know, fantastic business online and so on, kind of an Andrew Tate, you know, Jordan Peterson ideology, which, you know, quite a lot of young men are identifying with.
Yeah, I see two things there. On the one hand, there's this idea that our jobs, the regime of work, is always a sort of individualistic project, and in the end, the slogan is kind of how to become a millionaire, but the horizon of a collective perspective of work is kind of gone or is vanished. And on the other way, in addition, this idea that understands freedom as the absolute capability of choice, I mean, I wonder if it's linked with this rise of freedom in the right sense, right? We know famously that Javier Milei got elected with this slogan, "Viva la libertad, carajo." And so the question would be, what to do if this strong and powerful concept as freedom has been reduced to this tyranny of choice and transformed into a weapon of right? How could we build up different concepts of freedom?
You know, Argentina is a great example. I was there just before the last elections. And I'm friendly with a young entrepreneur who, you know, established a couple of businesses there. He's in late 30s, and I was shocked before the elections when I spoke to him, and he said he is going to vote for Milei. And why? His idea was that he has lived 20 years in economic crisis. You know, although he himself is successful, his feeling was that this 20 years of corruption and sort of kind of gloomy outlook on life that, you know, permeated his adult life was so bad that he preferred to risk everything, you know. He knew that, as one book said, Milei was a loco, you know, kind of a madman. But he thought it's better maybe to tear everything down than to continue in this kind of, let's say, the same passivity and corruption that existed. And was interesting, I saw him again after Milei was elected, and I asked him whether he was satisfied. And he said, like 50-50,
Oh, wow.
Yeah, like 50% chance that maybe he succeeds, 50% that everything fails. So I would say that, a lot of people are voting for this kind of populist leaders because of the exhaustion with the kind of the neoliberal capitalism that we have lived in now for a few decades.
So you see an exhaustion and then a sort of shift or change with this rise of leaders such as Milei, the re-election of Trump?
Yeah, there is definitely, I would say, exhaustion with the kind of the lack of vision in the existing parties, which is why a lot of people are not voting, but they are not voting because they would be so passive, but they are often not voting because they have no one to vote for. They are more alienated than apathetic. They just don't see the point in any program of sort of what is on offer in society. And they don't want the continuation of the kind of the same, sort of like in principle, let's say left-leaning ideologies like Peronistas, but extremely corrupt in essence.
Yeah, and regarding the affective culture of this manosphere and this rise of right-wing parties, many years ago we got familiar with this phenomenon called the incel. That is the male people that were involuntarily celibate. There were these other concepts about vol cells, so men that voluntarily stand celibate, and for different reasons, in these days we see, at least in Spain, the phenomenon of the femme cell. Yeah. That is, women that renounce to this culture that only considers them as a sexual object and requires them always to be pretty, beautiful. That is, it's a sort of refusal of the male gaze as such, right? Parallel with those phenomena, we see the increasement of what now is called the undesired loneliness, the soledad no deseada, the involuntary solitude. So in the end, there's a whole fragilization of all the bounds, or the direct cut of this bound. So how do you link that? So because apparently we're in this culture of desire and self-election, but it's even more and more difficult to really love somebody or be loved by somebody.
Yeah, and that's a good point you said at the end, because a lot of people in regard to love nowadays are questioning, whether they are loved. They're questioning less whether they love. Yeah. And that's quite a global phenomenon. Recently, I was speaking with psychoanalysts from Turkey. And they were saying exactly the same thing: the rise of loneliness, the inability to find a partner, the exhaustion with online dating, and also the retreating of genders to themselves, like women together, men socializing together. Also some groups which are kind of similar to the incels, and desire which lasts like between 1 week and a month. So the psychoanalysts were observing a lot of their younger clients, they were having, kind of a passionate start of a relationship, but the inability to continue because very quickly there was a loss of desire, on both sides, or sometimes on one side, just a lack of thrill. And also kind of a will to continue knowing each other.
Yeah.
And that's what in some way is making loneliness incredibly difficult to deal with. Unfortunately, AI is offering now, the apps called Friend, which will be like something you will be wearing. And instead of having like a real friend, you will have the AI friend, which looks like a kind of a piece of jewelry. You are talking to this online machinery, the AI friend, complaining about life, and the friend is trying to appease you in one way to another. But people who tested this application said that their anxiety radically increased after a few days of having this new friend.
I see. Well, many questions about that, but so to your mind, there's in effective relationships or romantic relationships, so to speak, there's a first fascination and then a sort of exhaustion of desire, a quick exhaustion of desire. What do you think are the causes of that? So we fall in love instantaneously, intensely, and then it vanishes like that.
Yeah, already in my choice book, and also in the anxiety book, and even in the ignorance book, I looked at love. And in all these years, it appears that the problems are quite similar. Let's say the online dating definitely relied on this idea of choice, that you can kind of make a choice, and then, actually the main problem with this idea of choice is that often, in love, it is truly in an unconscious way that we are attracted to someone or not. And we cannot easily put that in words. We also cannot easily tell another what attracts us, or what we actually feel about him or her. If I ask my partner, do you love me? It will not, whatever he will say might not satisfy me. I will be searching for the tone of his voice. I will be trying to read in between the lines, so to the desire of the other for you, you can never find a satisfying answer, something that will appease your anxiety, to make you in some way kind of fulfilled with how you perceive that the another looks at you. So I would say that that's one of the problems, the kind of that the app system of the new commerce of love. It is still a market, like it was in the past. People are, searching in the market. They're comparing the value of others. They are judging their own value in regard to who responds to them. So this machinery works too much on the idea really of choice, and less leaves the space for serendipity, for the unknown, which often is what kind of triggers a fascination.
Yeah. Well, this is just so relatable, but so one of the conclusions of your book, of the tyranny of choice, is precisely that this insistence of being able to choose ends up triggering an obsessive need to control and predict, or the rise or the return of a certain idea of big other, right? We see this idea of big other in certain return of religion. Well, you saw in this very week this Rosalia's cover of her new album, which is kind of about religion. So there's a nun in the cover. But what interests me is this paradox, right? In the society of choice, we end up being obsessive to control anything. And maybe, I don't know, I wonder if it is precisely this what makes us so intolerable to love. We has to do, maybe I'm a romantic, maybe, I don't know, but love has to do with transformation, with chaos, with disorganization, right? So maybe is this anxiety to control anything, to make up limitations and reasons to not choose this or that makes impossible this jump, right? This leap of faith that always love is about.
Yeah. Now, psychologists who work on choice have, done a lot of experiments about, even banal type of choices. When you go to a big department store, if there are, 10 types of, like a marmalade or something, you will buy one. If there are 100, you might not buy one because it's just too much. You know, you get lost and you lose the desire also. That's, you know, also in some way with the online, you know, market of love, where there is so much choice. You always think there is maybe something better around the corner. And, you know, the research which looked more in depth at this was also, you know, looking at, let's say, a person is searching for a woman where he has like a master degree and he would like to have a partner, maybe, you know, also with similar kind of education. And then, you know, a person answers to the ad who has a better education, even better. And then he thinks, maybe I should kind of search for actually really more educated people. But then, you know, if a more educated person actually shows interest in him or her, the person might think, but how come when they are so much more educated than they are looking at me? Something must be wrong with them. You know, like, how come that they are not looking at someone similar? And the most tragic example for me about the market of love happened in China. Last year, when I was in China, by coincidence, when I was visiting a town, Dalian, which is, you know, sort of quite close to Korea, and there I had a guide, a woman who told me she was on the market for love. Her aunt was going every Friday to the city park with a poster advertising her. Now, the guide showed me this park. It is one of the saddest things. You see parents there, or uncles and aunts and so on, with posters where it is, okay, a small photo of a man or a woman who is searching for a partner, and then all the other information, it's about status and finance. So it is what's the education of the person, of course, age, and then, you know, whether they own property, whether they own a car, how much money they have, whether their parents have a pension, whether their parents are well insured, and so on. And then when, you know, parents meet other parents there, or, you know, or other relatives, they check first the finances. And, you know, the woman told me at the first date, she takes an uncle with her who works in finance, so that they check whether the other potential partner truly owns everything that he was listing on. So this showed for me, you know, kind of the next sad step, I would say, in which we are trying to get out of loneliness, and a lot of young Chinese men and women are extremely lonely. That's a society problem there and, you know, elsewhere. You know, where we are going. Actually, I feel almost that we are kind of going back to the feudal times, you know, kind of checking, you know, the pedigree of a potential partner.
I see. I mean, there's a term in popular culture to think about all these things. Is the term FOMO, the fear of missing out. And these terms actually follows, we may say, one of your theories that understands that we are motivated more by avoiding loss than by gaining something, right? Like you got this fear of missing out, which is also one of the emphasis or contradictions of this compulsion of choice, right? Some years ago, in popular culture, in memetics, there's another popular term that it's a sort of contradiction of the former, which is the JOMO, the joy of missing out, right? That tries to express in very simple terms this collective aim of refusing all these seductive plans, all this stress, all these stimulations, and, you know, rather stays in bed, stays at place, cooking something, chill. So instead of this continuous performance of the self, JOMO, the joy of missing out, is about, we may say, the disappearance of the subject, or something maybe different than these logics of narcissism. I don't know if you see there a possible alternative, or just one more case of this exhaustion of this hyperstimulated desire.
Yeah, so this goes in your direction of work about laziness.
This is true.
Yes, which is, I think this kind of joy of missing out has been on the rise after the pandemic, where
Exactly.
people actually retreated more, were socializing less, or when the moment for socializing comes, many would say, do I really bother? And that's what I think was one of the remnants of the pandemic. Kind of less socializing. Maybe also in some way that's kind of linked to exhaustion, which is one of the things today. The feeling of burnout, the feeling, of constantly running. But pretty much running on the spot.
Yeah.
Which is like what we're constantly doing.
And to face all these psychic sufferings, depression, burnout, loneliness, there's also a tendency to do therapy, so to speak, with the ChatGPT, right? I'm alone in my place. I feel that nobody loves me. I feel that I cannot love anymore. I mean, I have all these kind of negative feelings. I'm brain rotting on my bed, scrolling, and I don't know, eating pizza, whatever. And I don't have money to pay a therapist or an analyst or something. And I asked to the chat, I don't know, from the standpoint of psychoanalysis, what do you think about this tendency? Do you think it's a good one? It's dangerous? Not?
Yeah, chat is like becoming like a new mirror, where often we get back kind of a reflection. Chat is also, often giving us, very positive feedbacks.
Yeah.
Fantastic question, amazing, you're really going deep, and so on,
Yeah, you're so clever.
Yeah,
so,
we need to, of course, understand that chat relies on the vast amount of, sort of information, and it's also taking information about us inside. So we are like kind of also the subject out of which, AI is profiting, is adding about, information about us to the database that might be used for. We don't know yet which purposes, or at least will be a mechanism on which large language models are learning. And of course, we need to be sort of kind of careful when people identify very strongly with AI. And we have seen examples where, especially teenagers took these conversations very seriously, sometimes, to the point of, ending their own lives. We know about those cases. We know where teenagers committed suicide after, many discussions with AI, where in some way the AI was in some way encouraging, such development. And I would say that in the future there will be more of this, definitely, because there is no limit to the Silicon Valley companies playing with artificial intelligence. And I'm quite worried about it. I'm not someone who doesn't see positive parts of artificial intelligence. But my fear is, first of all, that actually no one is controlling the large corporations. There is also no political desire, at least in the United States, to put some kind of a limit or to find, a kind of a legal way to deal with the problems that are opened with the expansive way in which we are developing AI. And, the new worry for me is exactly what we are dealing with now, the new application called Sora, which has been recently issued by ChatGPT. At the moment, it is available only if people are invited to download it. It is for free. Now, this application allows people to create small videos, video films, And what has happened in this last week is first that images of many dead people have been featured in these films.
Yeah.
So, well-known dead people like Princess Diana, Queen Elizabeth, Malcolm X, and so on. And the other problem is that there have been a lot of fake films of crime. So people would create a film of a crime scene that never happened, which looks like it was recorded by security camera. So in the legal domain, the big debate these days is whether video evidence will in the future still be admitted in the court, because videos can so easily be now manipulated. My worry is also that if we continue this path, there will be a real problem for people distinguishing between what is true and what isn't. And there has been, actually no benefit, I think, to these films. So I can imagine there can be a huge benefit from artificial intelligence when we are working on, new treatment for cancer. But creating, little films of, dead people, and also, or cats jumping from the roof. One of the most, made film is cat being sucked into tornado, or a cow, being kind of, taken away by tornado wind. What's the enjoyment in that?
No, absolutely, yeah. If we go back to effective capitalism, maybe one of the possibilities of this ChatGPT's intelligence is to avoid for a second or to control our anxiety, right? We know that in Spain, nearly 60% of the population reports suffering from stress, and around 25% from anxiety. And actually, we live in a system in which the continuous promise is to end up with this anxiety, right? It is as if we cannot stand loss or lack or, randomness, right? We need to keep going this fantasy that everything goes on, everything is under control, and we are somehow in this fantasy mastering everything, right? But the problem, and you deal with it in one of your books, is that this continuous promise to end up with anxiety, as if anxiety was the last obstacle to reach a sort of happiness, plenitude, whatever, ends up making us more anxious, right? So my question again is what happens here, right? There's people like Mark Fisher observes that the American way of life, capitalism in the Cold War years, promised to put an end to anxiety and boredom. Now everybody has a smartphone, and we may say boredom is over because we take our phone, we do some scrolling, and it's gone. But at the same time, as the statistics show, stress and anxiety goes on and increases continuously. I mean, what happens there? What happens with this sort of intolerance to lack and loss?
Yeah, there are two, I would think, sides of anxiety. As human beings, we deal with anxiety and existential anxiety throughout our life, which, is something that can be also very helpful. So, when Freud was analyzing anxiety, his point was that, people who experience an accident, let's say that they were victims of a train crash, going, after this, and they survived, nothing terrible happened to them, but they might have nightmare after, and they might also have anxiety to again take a train. His idea was that, this anxiety has like a kind of a role where we want, in advance of possible repeat disaster, prevent it, protect ourselves. So Freud's idea was that there is like some kind of a protective part in anxiety. And, in a way, anxiety is as philosophers from Kierkegaard to Sartre and others have already analyzed, is, often linked to possibility of possibility, So like Sartre said, when we are standing in front of the abyss, it is not simply that we are anxious that we will fall, but we are also anxious that we have the freedom to jump into the abyss, And that kind of is always about, our attitude towards life. We have, in a way, the possibility to end life too. Now, if anxiety is a kind of a human affect, it can be increased by, the way society functions and especially by the media. So already traditional media have, kind of often increased our anxiety. I remember in times of socialism when I was growing up in former Yugoslavia, I remembered how boring the television news were. News on the television were kind of, read in a monotonous voice. I was, reading book or knitting or doing something, and you would just kind of listen a little bit and not really kind of being anxious by what you were hearing, So you were getting a bit informed, and then I visited the United States, and I noticed how the news were making me anxious, because the tone in which they were presented were this affected thing that where I felt it's like the end of the world, what's happening? And, like the cat got lost, or, something terribly banal happened. Now, the news are presented like this pretty much globally, which is creating not only, the feeling of anxiety among listeners, but also anger. So we need to understand that quite often media contributes to both, the feeling of anger, that we feel, and sometimes also kind of apathy. We can't take it anymore, it's too much, and anxiety. And of course, social media, in its own way, also contribute to anxiety. A lot of research has been done about the way people perceive their bodies. When they are, a lot of hours per day on social media, let's say, especially Instagram. So among young girls, they observed, the psychologists, that if young girls are observing a lot of bodies of other, beautiful young girls, like fashion models, influencers, but also, their friends online, they might perceive themselves in a very negative way. They might be anxious that they are not beautiful or thin enough and so on. And if they are posting their own images, the feeling of anxiety often increases, or the feeling of dissatisfaction. So we can say that we are living really in times where there are so many stimulus that this anxiety, which is essential human affect, is becoming, overwhelming.
So on the one hand, and I think this is also a Sloterdijk idea, we live in a society that produces stress and anxiety. Sloterdijk observed that our society is only balanced through that constant dynamization. So all the media, first and foremost, no matter the information or the contents, are producers of this sort of excitation, right? So on the one hand, we got this, but on the other hand, and I love very much you quote Kierkegaard here and in your books, anxiety, or we may say dread, is something, so to speak, inherent or connatural to our condition of free human beings. But on the one hand, we have this continuous promise that anxiety will end up someday, and we don't know how to deal with it, right? So what would you say, what to do with this sort of anxiety of being alone, not being with your phone, to face a time with no object, with no dedication, with no efficiency?
Yeah, in regard to anxiety, I will point another thing. I remember when I was speaking with a person who was, engaged in this unfortunate war in Iraq, an American colonel, and I asked him, how do you deal with the anxiety of your soldiers? And his answer was, actually, for me, the bigger problem is not when soldiers are anxious, but if I have soldiers who don't have anxiety. Now, a person who doesn't have anxiety actually might, do a very cruel thing. So I would say that anxiety is an important affect, which is also kind of an essential element of us being social beings. Because we need to be anxious over the question, what is right and wrong, what should I do or what I shouldn't do. Also, we are always a bit anxious in regard to the question of how we are regarded by others. In Lacanian psychoanalysis, we speak also about the big other, which is kind of the social setting, the social symbolic space in which we live, the culture, language, everything around us. So we might question of who are we, in the social setting around us. How does this society regard us? Do we have status? Are we regarded with respect? Or these are kind of anxiety-provoking questions. And of course, going back to love is very anxiety-provoking.
Yeah.
Like always. And that's not too bad.
It's not too bad.
No, because, you need to deal with this kind of a question of, let's say, who am I for the other, and who is the other for me, which are both, in a way, an anxiety-provoking question.
Will we accept the answer to these questions?
Sorry?
Will we accept the answers to these questions? Who am I for the other? Who is the other for me? Sorry, as you think, I'm very concerned with this topic.
No, you don't need to accept it. It's just part of, let's say, human relationships. And as I said before, that you will never get an appeasing answer.
Yeah.
So dissatisfaction is part of love, which is okay.
That's a good one, yeah. In other of your books, you talk about how this sort of generalized anxiety ends up with some apathy, with some lethargy, and even something that you understand in many ways, a sort of passion of ignorance. You rather not know, or all the politicians are the same, like, okay, I quit this stupid contest of stress and anxiety. Some philosophers argue that ignorance can serve as protection against the excess of information and choice, and hence as a protection against anxiety. Could you tell us about this passion for ignorance and how it manifests in everyday life?
Yeah, as psychoanalysis has analyzed already way back, people don't have passion for knowledge, but rather a passion for ignorance. So often people come to analysis with the desire to know what's wrong with them, what are their symptoms, why they are suffering, but very quickly they don't want to know. They do everything not to know, to close their eyes. And the important thing about ignorance is that sometimes it can be beneficial for us. When we are, let's say, going through a traumatic illness, for some, closing their eyes might be, quite essential just to somehow keep going. For some, knowing, is appeasing their anxiety. For others, knowing too much, might be really something that they want to avoid. I remember a well-educated couple when one of them was going through, cancer diagnosis. When this cancer diagnosis happened, we were having dinner and they said, oh, happily, the person doesn't have cancer. And I was like, what? But everyone knows that the person has cancer. And I realized that it was at that moment, that the information was just too much. They needed time to go through. And, in some way, when we deal with some traumatic things, not only illness, sometimes, we also consciously close our eyes. So sometimes unconsciously, we do everything not to know, and sometimes consciously. Let's say some people decide that on the weekends, we will not speak about illness. We deal with it during the weekdays because we go to doctors and so on. On the weekends, we will pretend as if everything is okay, although they know that everything is not okay. Then the other problem with ignorance is that we are in ignorance because many or the state mechanisms or whatever keep us in ignorance. They don't want us to know too much. And so there is this structural ignorance at work in society. In regard to big data, how it is used, how it is collected, we are actually in ignorance. We don't know what is actually happened in how the algorithms are working. That's kind of, again, another structural ignorance. Now, what is essential about ignorance is that there is also sort of like a moment where you cannot know. So, sometimes, there are things where literally, there is an unknown in the an element of it. When we were going through pandemic, that was like there was some moment where literally science had to admit we don't know. We don't know how the virus will, develop. And of course, these moments where we need to admit the unknown are essential for, the development of science. However, they often open up, the kind of let's say, the space for the denial of science or, even kind of, let's say, passionate anti-science movements like we saw with the pandemic, with the anti-vaxxers and similar type of oppositions of what science was saying about the pandemic.
So apart from this structural production of ignorance, we got this passion for ignorance because maybe true is too much for us. We cannot stand it, and we rather prefer to look somewhere else to in a way be safe, so to speak, at least in our minds. If we take this, we may assume that a certain passion to know could be a sort of a way to go in the direction of the cure somehow, or to a certain transformation, or to certain admission. So you say that we usually prefer not to know, are passionate about ignorance, but how could we go into this passion to know or to decipher the causes of our anxiety?
Yeah, if we go back to love, in love, actually love passions often require a certain ignorance. Knowing too much about another might kill, the passion, which is why we say love is blind. And romantic love often requires a little bit of blindness. If we know too much, the romantic love might end. Now, in today's times, there are many moments where we feel that we will come closer to the truth of subjectivity, maybe with the help of new knowledge, new technology. Like we had big beliefs in genetics. So I look in the book about this belief that there will be some kind of a truth in the genetics. If we will discover the genes, maybe we will prevent all kinds of illnesses and so on. Or, there was even a desire to find, certain particular kind of genes for crime or anything else. And of course, here a kind of a fantasy got created, that we might come close to the truth of subjectivity. And of course, this fantasy sometimes can be really dangerous, really dangerous to think that, people might be born criminals and so on.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we need to leave the space, I would say, for the unknown. There is always an element of the unknown in regard to the subjectivity, to, let's say, the question of who are we as humans. And that's where, I would say that ignorance is kind of an essential part of how we should understand the subject in regard to what is the truth of the subject.
I see. I mean, all these reflections about the passion of ignorance lead me to this classical discussion, classical philosophical question about how or why we desire our own repression, right? So Deleuze and Spinoza's question. And maybe if we don't take it in the right way, this passion for ignorance, I guess could have some problematic effects in politics. I mean, I remember in the 2016 US elections, one of Hillary Clinton's failed strategies was to label those who didn't vote for her as stupid, since they preferred the other candidate. We now know that, for example, when a precarious worker votes for the far right, which will likely worsen their conditions, it's not out of stupidity, but for deeper reasons, so to speak. How would you explain kind of this contradiction? So how would you address these sort of philosophical questions about the desire of our own alienation, the desire of our own repression?
Yeah, I think I would not want to use the idea of stupidity in the way that I would speak about sort of people becoming in a way more stupid and so on. In the book Maleducados, my idea was more to look at a certain kind of openness in today's society to become extremely rude to each other, to a kind of a lack of civility, which is linked to a certain social change where we are living, in times where we have, let's say, fewer of the kind of a social regulations, not laws, I would say, but kind of unwritten mechanisms which, when we go through the process of socialization, make something, regulated and often also prohibited. Let me give you an example. Sigmund Freud, let's say already 100 years ago, in his group psychology, was speaking about infection with syphilis. Now, at that time, quite a lot of people were getting syphilis, and Freud said, actually, people who get infected might be angry that they are infected, might be jealous that others are not, but, socialization has taught them that they should be careful not to infect others. So people have repressed the kind of aggressive impulses to endanger others because the social, let's say, discourse was about, not infecting. So although this was pushed to their unconscious, the anger, let's say, envy, and so that others are not infected consciously, they were doing everything not to endanger others. So, his idea was that social justice relies on the idea that I limit myself, hoping that others will limit themselves too. And, and that, I think, is changing today. So we are, having more and more, let's say, influential people, leaders, influencers, and so on, who are, openly obscene, using very rude language, that gives quite a lot of others the permission, of certain rudeness, which is not necessarily, violence, but is kind of an incivility. And unfortunately, it is, I would say, also, kind of damaging the social fabric of society, the way we interact one with another. And let me give you an example from Turkey. My publisher in Turkey shared with me an interesting idea. She's translating now in Turkish this language, this book, Maleducados, and she said she was recently taking a subway, and so it was packed. Now, the woman is in her mid-60s, and she said she was standing there in this packed metro, and, a very elegant woman next to her with very high heels steps onto, the feet of my editor. And my editor just said, like, ouch, this reflex that you make. Now, the other woman started shouting at my editor, like, how dare you put your foot under my shoe? You know, so this is where you can see, you know, a complete reversal in civility. You would expect the apology. I'm sorry, you know, I didn't see you, you know, like this retreat and not the attack.
Yeah. Actually, I remember how, for example, Italian far-right was sold as a sort of fascism with good manners, right? So it seems like we come from a moment of good vibes, good feeling good. Sorry. So a moment of enthusiasm and a sort of compulsory smiling. And all of a sudden, there's this outburst of rudeness where people really gross, like, well, you know, Millet, Trump, all these guys, defend this sort of impoliteness, right? How would you see this shift, this change in affective culture? I don't know if it's just a certain, exhaustion of these good manners. Maybe it's just because we perceive them as just fake, because no matter how good the promises and intentions are, finally the material conditions does not change, and this ends up making us choose other leaders. How would you appreciate these changes in the affective culture of late capitalism?
Now, this, I would say, this fakeness can be quite useful. You know, it is better if people don't say everything that is in their mind, you know, to each other, especially if they are politicians. Kind of a restraint might be helpful, you know, even if it's a fake restraint. So I'm not about unleashing all the emotions, whatever comes into your head. And we need to understand that this rudeness is really also fueling anger. So what we are observing today is two things. On the one side, apathy, and on the other side, anger. Anger, which you can observe everywhere, you know, and it is often justified anger. So with anger also, we should not perceive anger simply negative. If we go to, let's say, the history of philosophy, for example, Hannah Arendt wrote very interestingly about anger, how important anger is for political change. She said sometimes anger is necessary when we are fighting for justice, you know, to make something visible. However, she points out that, you know, when you have anger which is not tied to certain ideals, let's say of equality, rights, justice, or something that can articulate it and possibly, you know, bring social change, anger can easily lead to violence. You know, anger, which is not necessarily articulated, can be incredibly disruptive for society. Now, for individuals, anger is something that we learn about throughout our upbringing, throughout our socialization. And the way others around us, especially our primary caregivers, respond to our anger when we are young, when, let's say, we are babies, will also, you know, in a way color the way we deal with anger later in life. Let's say when we are little children, often our crying is a sign of anger. How this crying is responded to is something that will teach us, you know, about whether our anger can be, you know, sort of articulated. Also, it's very important that, you know, we learn to put anger later in life in words, to kind of articulate it with language, not simply leave it at the kind of affective level.
I see. Well, let me finish with one of my my favorite pieces of your writing in Maleducados, because we've been talking about, well, about love, about anxiety, about apathy and lethargy, and about this sort of political fight we may find in anger itself, right? But in your last book, you speak about another passion that maybe is one of my favorite. You talk about a certain passion for quietness, right? Or maybe I'd rather call it just laziness. And you observe that this passion for quietness leads to a critical attitude of rejecting work or just a precarious system or precarious conditions of work. And you mentioned a sort of silent resistance to all these neoliberal imperatives of happiness that aims at putting an end to our anxiety, right? Apparently, this passion emerged at the twilight of the enthusiasm for doing and growing amid the lethargy we've mentioned. I have the impression that this passion fools alliances and collective bonds where a narcissistic culture once prevailed, and that it holds revolutionary potential to help us imagine new forms of political coexistence. Well, this is what I think. But I want to know, of course, what do you think and how this passion for quietness enters in this sort of arena of affective economies?
Yeah, so in China during COVID, they observed this phenomenon of Tamping lying low, where workers were just doing the minimum of minimum, sort of like enough not to be fired. So that they were like lying low at work. They were not, extending themselves, not exhausting themselves. And that was like a form of resistance they perceived. We have also in the past, seen, this kind of a phenomenon. About 10 years ago, French psychoanalyst, I think her name is Corinne Miller, if I'm not mistaken, wrote a book about how for the whole year when she got employed on purpose in some mobile phone company, she did nothing. Literally, her whole idea was to do nothing. And, she succeeded. They didn't fire her. No one actually noticed that she did pretty much nothing. Maybe others, bosses, were doing nothing too, And we can say that these are forms of resistance which, people who are fully employed might play with, but we have more and more people in gig economy, in the part-time jobs, self-employed, under part-time contracts and so on, who cannot, lie low. If they lie low, they will not earn anything, So I would say that there are limits of the, revolutionary potential of those kind of forms of resistance. They are often desperate methods, kind of rejecting this neoliberal push for working more and more. But, I think that what is the crucial problem today is that there are less and less of possibilities of actually articulating the revolt, the workers' revolt, politically, even with the help of trade unions and so on. And, if we go back to rudeness, we must say that the rudeness has been very much promoted by neoliberal capitalism. The idea that you succeed if you are in some way aggressive enough. When you are climbing the ladder of success, you have to be in a way rude. You kind of use other people as tools for yourself. You kind of discard them when you don't need them. You fire them. The enjoyment in firing, which we have seen with The Apprentice, the President Trump's, series and other similar series. That is some rudeness which is shaping, I would say, our cultures, through the media. Any show that you watch, like, I don't know, MasterChef or whatever, I can't watch those shows. It's about rudeness. Who will be fired, who will be humiliated, and the humiliation is the point where the viewers find the enjoyment, in this kind of small cruelties. And that, for me, has been kind of present in today's culture, accepted form of rudeness linked to the idea of success, which is then opening doors, I would say, to other forms of rudeness, aggression, incivility that we observe in today's society.
I see. Well, I would like to ask you more questions, but maybe it's time to address the audience. So, abrimos ahora un turno de palabra para continuar la conversación con intervenciones, preguntas, comentarios del público.
Hola, buenas tardes. Quería agradecerle a la doctora, la ponente, su intervención. Tengo dos preguntas. La primera en relación con el aspecto de la elección. No sé si se ha estudiado o no, desde un punto de vista sociológico, si las personas eligen más por el pensamiento racional y lógico o por la intuición. Y respecto de la intuición, si existen algún tipo de estudios que puedan revelar si elegir por la intuición lleva antes al éxito o no necesariamente. Y respecto a la ansiedad, y en combinación con lo que se ha comentado en relación con el anger, la violencia o el enfado, ¿cómo explicaría usted, teniendo en cuenta la situación sociológica en Europa, que la inmensa mayoría de la población no se rebele ante la enorme cantidad de injusticias o de casos de corrupción o de, no sé cómo llamarlo, de cosas que no funcionan de la manera habitual, y la población en su inmensa mayoría decida no rebelarse o no opte por la violencia o por el desenfado? Muchas gracias.
Thank you for both great questions. In regard to intuition or rational choice, okay, Freud already made, quite a passing remark once, saying that, already in his time, people, when it comes to small things in life, like daily small choices, maybe we should think rationally long and hard before we make them. But when it comes to big choices, like to get married or to have children, you should just do it. And that would probably be more like, intuition. His idea was, no matter how much you will try to think and rationally choose, there will be, an element of unconscious which will be linked to your choice, and there will always be, some dissatisfaction, so you can't rationally choose those kind of elements where, your life might really change, for example, getting married or not. Okay, getting married with a terribly wrong person might really require some rational thinking, definitely. So I would say that intuition would be something linked to what I was saying, are these two elements which shape our rational choices, which is what society perceives as an important choice, family also around us. Even if we rationally think we don't take it into account, we do. And of course, the kind of the unconscious mechanisms where, no matter how much rationally you might make your choices, maybe you are guided by something in you that is beyond your, let's say, rational thinking. And that might be the kind of the unconscious push that guides you. Now, in regard to the anxiety question and the question of revolt, I pose this question to myself often. How come that we don't see more of an organized, actually, revolt in society? Actually, more of an articulated anger against corruption, against mismanagement in politics, even against climate change, if we look at it. It looks that the neoliberal ideology was very successful in pacifying people. And I think that this idea of individual choice and the whole glorification of choices in our individual lives has been an essential element to push away the question of social choices. And, the question of social choices is what should be leading us in our anger against, corruption, against inequality, against climate change, against militarization. We should not forget that problem.
Más preguntas, comentarios. Por aquí.
Hi, I have a question regarding happiness. So very often in the contemporary self-help discourse, we hear happiness is a choice. What is your opinion on that? And how do you see, if you see that a danger on zero tolerance towards suffering, discomfort, and so on?
Yeah, unfortunately, the discourse on happiness has created a lot of misery in our lives. You know, the whole idea that you need to work on your happiness or even happiness of your children, and that you are kind of a failure if you are not happy, if you are not making the right choices to increase your happiness, has created a lot of the feelings of anxiety, a lot of the feeling of inadequacy, and of course a lot of business for self-help gurus who are, you know, endlessly writing the books or giving us podcasts and advices on how to increase one's happiness. Happiness, you know, might be a fleeting moment, you know, when just for a tiny bit of a moment we feel elated, we feel content, you know, in bliss, and so on. This is something that you can't work towards. It cannot be your goal, which is related to what kind of choices you are making. It is a huge pressure on people, especially in love relationship, that they need to feel, you know, happy, or that we need to have happy children. Now, when I was growing up, no one was thinking that children should be happy. They should just kind of do the best work in school, be, you know, honest, do some work at home, and not be too much of a nuisance. And kind of were not an object that parents were shaping. You know, parents were not obsessing about extracurricular activities, what we are doing in the afternoon, and they were not neglectful parents. There was just kind of freedom, I would say, that you took care of yourself, and, you know, as long as you did okay in school, you were fine, you know. And it was important also that you were bored enough. You need to be bored. There is really a lack of boredom with children. We feel there every minute, you know, instead of allowing them to be bored, endure when they are bored, because only when you are bored, you are kind of becoming creative. You figure out to fill your time with something. And I would say that especially creative work requires always a certain element of unhappiness. You know, if you are not unhappy with like your, let's say, last book or something, you will not write another one. You need to have a certain kind of, let's say, an urge to change something, you know, or to create something slightly different. And of course, you also need to have a little bit of a positive envy. So, you know, when someone else publishes a book, it's good to have like the idea, oh, you know, they already have a new book and I'm so lazy, so maybe I should speed up my writing, which is what, you know, the Russians are calling the white envy, which is like you are encouraged when, you know, someone is doing something. The black envy is, of course, when you want that what brings enjoyment to another will be killed. Let's say if you have a sports car and I'm envious, it's not that I want to have a sports car, but I just don't want you to enjoy it. So, you know, I'm thinking maybe you'll have a car crash.
Okay, more questions? There.
I wanted to pose you the question. You were talking about anti-voting behavior and how people are somehow disengaged with political system, but at the same time, how extreme right is rising. I guess the answer is because of this feeling of anger. But my question was, what do you think would mobilize moderate voters into engage again into the system, and maybe the reaction of this new wave of right wing, or what would be the answer? Thank you.
This is a really important question because let's say, it's very hard to compete with the extreme right, the kind of populist right-wing movements in their discourse, which uses, I would say, kind of obscenity, targets certain groups, migrants, LGBT, or whoever as guilty for the demise in society, and just, you know, the kind of a catastrophic language. Now, for people who oppose this discourse but still want social change, the question today is how to articulate these ideas that they are appealing to the public, how to articulate what we, let's say, call progressive ideas in a way that people might identify with them. Some are thinking about left-wing populism. So in the United States now we have, at least in New York, quite a successful campaign of Zoran Mamdani, the candidate for the mayor, who has been sort of using a version of this leftist populism, which relies on very simple demands, repeating the same message, you know, about you know, the equality, affordable housing, affordable public transport, also pro-Palestinian statements, and you know, also being a charismatic leader. So it always helps if there is a charismatic leader who is able to articulate this message. So I think that quite globally, you know, the problem for the left is truly how to, let's say, articulate the message that it is heard, and not actually lowering the discourse to the level of the kind of populist right, you know, which quite often we have seen has been rising all around Europe, and of course has been winning in the United States and Argentina and elsewhere.
Okay, we still time for one more question, una última pregunta, comentario. Por aquí.
Bueno, muchas gracias por la conversación. Tenía curiosidad por si en relación con esta glorificación de las decisiones, has abordado cómo algunas aportaciones recientes, y estoy pensando en Robert Sapolsky, el biólogo, o Catherine Hales, que ha hablado de la cognición no consciente, o Thomas Metzinger, que ha impugnado directamente la noción de yo como una ilusión. Bueno, si de algún modo has abordado estas aportaciones más desde la neurobiología o más desde la filosofía de la psicología con esa glorificación de la decisión en nuestras sociedades contemporáneas.
Thank you. I have not in particular, you know, sort of analyzed neuroscience in regard to, you know, the current discussions in neuroscience about choice. In the past, there has been, you know, too much of an optimism that neuroscience will help us kind of tackle the problematic type of choices, especially after, you know, the Libet experiment in the legal domain. Libet experiment was kind of measuring when we are making a certain gesture, let's say push a button or on certain machine, they were able to measure that in the brain there were already signs before we made a conscious choice to push the button. Some milliseconds before, you can see a vibration in the brain where, you know, it might be that actually the brain knew before consciously we knew or we decided to make something. So that experiment was opening, you know, a few decades ago, a whole debate whether we will still perceive a person responsible for crime. Let's say if the brain is sort of kind of making a decision before rationally someone makes a decision to do something unlawful, is it then that we can still, punish the person in the way we are doing it now, questioning whether he knew the difference between the right and wrong. At that time, some were thinking that we are in total redefinition of criminal law, which didn't happen. Of course, other scientists and philosophers were saying, yes, even if, let's say, the brain sends certain signals that we might do something, we still have a possibility of stopping it. So it's not that the brain is pushing us someone, that we still have a possibility of not do something. And I would say that in psychoanalytic perspective of choice, we embrace more the idea of a forced choice. The idea of a forced choice being, Freud was speaking about the idea of a forced choice, that we have moments which are choice and at the same they are not fully, elements of choice. So, for example, if we are approached by a robber, and the criminal demands from us, give the money or your life, I'll kill you if you don't give me the life. This is a forced choice. If we decide to keep money, we lose life, which means we won't be able to use the money at all, So it's a choice where choice is offered, money or life, but at the same time, it's only one answer possible, and some way give him the money and keep your life. So a lot of things in psychoanalysis are looked through this perspective of forced choice. Freud's idea was even that, there is like a kind of a choice of neurosis, of choice of psychosis. He didn't think that a person chooses, will I be neurotic or will I be psychotic? He only thought that, there is an element of a subjective element in the way, let's say, we are kind of structured. We are not simple tools of nature or culture. There is, an element where, the subject actually is the subject perceived of someone capable of making choices, although, as I said, some choices are actually not rational choices.
Bueno, quería para acabar hacer un pequeño comentario. I will do it in Spanish if it's fine. Renata nos habla en sus últimos trabajos a propósito de la descortesía del mundo y de esta creciente grosería. A mí me recuerda a un texto que tiene cientos de años de Oscar Wilde, que es La decadencia de la mentira. Justamente ahí Oscar Wilde decía que en una exigencia de transparencia o de naturalismo o de verdad, la mentira, el arte, la cortesía, los modales y en general, digamos, nuestra relación con el lenguaje, con lo que puede y con lo que no puede, está en decadencia. Creo que el pensamiento de Renata nos ayuda justamente a cuidar esas cosas que no sabemos, no tanto quizá la pasión por la ignorancia, pero a su cuidado, no tanto a evitar el riesgo, sino a relacionarnos con él y a aceptar que, bueno, que este mundo está lleno de zonas oscuras y que en lugar de evitarlas hay que saber convivir con ellas. En fin, muchas gracias, Renata. Thank you very much for this conversation. It's been a pleasure. Thank you all for being here.